Welcome to the live update. I don't even know what day it is today. Um, but I'm guessing it's the 27th of May, 2026. Oh, hi. Thanks for joining. I wasn't going to do an update this week because I feel very much in transition. But then I realized that maybe that's part of the project to document this. So I was just going over notes because I did have some thoughts. I think I titled this one like decision, time, and something else. I don't even know. But let me explain. Let me explain what I'm at. Okay, so there's many things going on as always in my life, and this particular moment, I feel very in the middle of things. That's why I wasn't going to do a live, because I was like, I'm still stuck in the middle. I don't really know what I'm up to or where I'm going exactly. Not that I don't know where I'm going, but it's not happening yet. And there's a pattern in so much of my work, which is about being in the process. And so, as much as this sounds ridiculous, one of the things that I've learned is that change takes time. Seems silly. Not a revelation if you really think about it. But the actual process of moving through change, and even when it's change like something that you're trying to create or a project that you're trying to bring forth and manifest, any kind of transformation, even one that you are crystal clear on, that your vision is so solid and well defined, even that will take time to develop. Duh. But I'm really curious about what it's like to be in the middle of the process of that kind of change and transformation. I mean, that's life. That's what I kind of put my focus on every day. And if I were to pull threads from all these different things that I've shared over the months, I think that I wish I could like model, like make a little model of something of this process, because I think there would be these sort of like dimensions and quadrants of elements, like it takes time, the feeling of being in that space, which leads to this sense of like trust or faith, or confidence. But I've really been ruminating so much lately on the notion of patience, which is something relatively new to me. Not that, like, maybe I'm not an impatient person, but I think this sense of patience pushes up against the urgency and the, like, short-term, immediate gratification that so many of us want to see, that just, truth be told, isn't really how much of the big stuff happens. So that's why I eventually decided to do a live stream, even though I feel quite unprepared for it. But that's okay, because the authenticity of the moment is that I am like in the middle of this. So it feels muddy, it feels amorphous, and it feels like, not sharp lines, well defined. But I know the one thing I can for sure say is that I am like in this pivot moment. I know I talked about that last week. I literally said, I feel like I'm in this pivotal transition moment where like I have to choose to do this thing. Excuse me. Uh-oh. And I feel like maybe we're all there, just with varying degrees of consciousness and intentionality, but I'm really in the space of wanting to choose how to go in the direction that I'm aiming for. Now, let's just be in the process together for that. One thing that I've been battling with while being in this process is my wild yet undiagnosed ADHD. I was talking with someone yesterday who was like, you for sure have ADHD. I know it's like a topic that I bring up a lot, but it was like, obviously, because lately I've been hyper-focusing on being a DJ I don't think I'm actually going to become a DJ, but I really, really have always talked about wanting to be a DJ for many years now. And that has come into its own form in the most accessible way available to me presently. And I'm really enjoying it. So I'm sitting here thinking, like, God, why am I so passionate about being a DJ now? Wasn't I just trying to be a metaphilosophical performance artist? But it's all connected. And I just have to continue accepting that about myself. So while I've been thinking about DJing dance parties and fitting that into the philosophical projects, I've also had many other ideas pop up of things that I want to do that can feel frustrating when it sounds like I'm just always changing my mind. That might seem like a symptom of some kind of neurodivergence or ADHD, or maybe it could seem flighty, or maybe it seems like, a person who can't commit to anything, but that's not my experience of it, because in my experience of being in this space where I have actually so much latitude to be able to experiment and explore, which is itself kind of a unique condition, I understand. But when we give ourselves the conditions to have so much space to move, like going back weeks and weeks ago to like the abyss of like, what if you just kind of like explore a little bit in the abyss? What if you just hang out there and see what happens? That level of spaciousness and curiosity, coupled with a commitment to creativity and experimentation. Did I say that many times? Whatever. I think it's natural and probably a good thing to have a lot of little ideas bubble up and test and try them. I know that in myself, I can have this sort of attitude that is probably like deeply ingrained from years of conditioning of like, you got to choose your path, commit, work hard, stay focused, and see it through. And that can be hard for a lot of people, but also it maybe isn't necessarily like the appropriate approach if being nimble and agile and flexible can continue our progress, but not necessarily have it look in the scripted, tight kind of way. So over the past several years, the way that this has shown up for me is that like I've given myself so much grace to just kind of like try stuff out. And I've probably leaned the most into that space in the past 2.5 years. So I wonder sometimes if it looks on the outside like I'm just making stuff up. or I said to a friend recently, like, God, I'm sure this looks so delusional. And she was like, it doesn't look delusional. You look committed. It seems like you are committed, and it is inspiring. And I hope that maybe that's more the energy that this is all giving off of, like the intensity and myriad of experiments is really just because I have the conditions available to do all of that. So it can look like floundering, related to the radical first that I've talked about before. Like, am I flying? Am I falling? Am I failing? Or am I floundering? Who knows? But there's this is literally the moment I'm trying to capture of like what it's like to be in the middle of all of that. So let me show you some clarity where I think I'm going and what I intend to continue pursuing has not changed. It is still the epistemology of intimacy. It just looks like a lot of different things. I even feel like my mind sort of has these like octopus-like tentacles all branching off. And you know how like an octopus has like 8 brains or something? That's what it feels like in my head. There's like 8 different projects always forming in my brain. And so then that looks like 8 different tentacles out in the world, kind of doing their own little movements and dances. And maybe I just have to really like wholeheartedly embrace moving like an octopus. So all of that, though, I think my clarity is like under a larger umbrella of the epistemology of intimacy. And that's just what I'm trying to figure out how it looks. I'm really, really just so grateful to have the space to do this. And I'm approaching a big birthday, so I've been thinking a lot about my life over the past 10 years in particular. And I'm like, I'm all over the place, but I'm going to stop apologizing for that. But in thinking about my birthday, which is going to be yet another experiment, I said, I think back in December, I was like, oh, I have this idea for my 40th birthday to do a stand-up philosophy set. And that is quickly approaching. So I'm in the process of creating that because I said I was going to do it. Not because I'm forcing myself to do it, because I had the idea and it's been germinating like as a little seed for near 6 months now. But as I'm pursuing that, I had a really lovely conversation with my best friend last weekend. She came up for a visit, which is always a treat. And we've known each other now for over 15 years. We were just reflecting back on like what it was like when we met in our early mid-20s. We were, she was finishing up undergrad. I was in the middle of graduate school. And life was just so different. And I, in myself, am thinking like, God, I thought I had my shit together. I thought I was like, on top of it and really smart and really like with it. But I was so unhealthy in so many ways. And I was in a very unhealthy environment. Like graduate school was not a healthy time for me. So I made unhealthy decisions and moved in unhealthy ways, even though I was doing my best. But now I like think back to where I was even at 30, which was no longer in graduate school. I was in Fort Collins. I was in a job that I didn't think I would ever have. And even then, what a world of a difference it's been. So maybe there's a thread here that we can loop in together, but I'm thinking like, reflecting back on my own 10 years, and especially the past 5, which have been so monumental, the changes are dramatic, yet the process has been so diligent that it almost looks slow in a way. Like, I'm really thinking like, wow, this has been 5 years or 2.5 years. That's not a week. That's not a weekend retreat. It's not a summer camp. It's not an intensive 12-week course that did this for me. So this arc of transformation, even which is so dramatic and palpable in my own embodied experience, in my own emotional landscape, in my own conceptual frameworks, in my own spiritual kind of, perspectives. Pretty much everything has holistically changed for me, and that has happened over time. So I know I've been like in this strange relationship with time for the past several months too, but in looking back now, I can see how it makes sense to be patient in the process as things are developing. And that the way that shows up for me now these days is like, I can feel anxious, I can feel stressed, I can feel, scared about the uncertainty or what's happening, or if this will continue to be viable in any stretch of the imagination. And those are deep wounds and core like anxieties that I've had my whole life about like security and stability and safety, that have translated in many ways to like hyper independence and all this kind of stuff. But over the past 5 years, I can see how even that relationship has been so fundamentally shifted in me to where now I have this greater degree of trust, and I call it sometimes faith. In many ways, I think it probably looks like confidence and it feels like confidence or conviction. And now I'm adding on to that catalog of where it's also patience, because I can see and appreciate and recognize the time that it takes for things to unfold and develop in a way that isn't just, maybe there's something like shifting. Like it's not like the leaf turns and now everything's dramatically different. But like when we have certain changes, I think it's good for those changes to be grounded, and that takes time. You know what I mean? Like if someone shows up like a month later, they went on some international backpacking trip and they came back a whole different person, I kind of feel it a little unsettling. Like, what happened? And trauma can do that too. Think about people who go through a really traumatizing experience and then that like it's a negative example, but completely alters like your personality or your livelihood. I mean, maybe you have a near-death experience and it changes you positively. I don't know. But like those dramatic shifts that sort of happen in a short term maybe I'm just not as confident in their durability. Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter, because what I'm in right now is trying to do this durable transition where it feels a little bit more grounded. And I'm just in the middle of it. But I think it's been nice even to feel myself be able to make certain choices in the space of that kind of patience, where I'm like, well, I guess I will do a live, because this update is intended to document the process, and the process isn't just like, here's a new outcome, like as if I'm turning out, I don't know, KPIs. I don't know this kind of language, but like, if I'm hitting my goals and everything, so I'm just going to be doing updates on here's the thing that happened. Like, the purpose of this is to really document the process, and the process is also kind of like sludgy in the middle sometimes. So I'm in the sludge, and I wish there was a way to like teleport, like a being John Malkovich kind of moment of like sharing the shift in my own embodied experience of that sludgy middle. Because if I were to compare myself, again, I'm just being redundant now, but if I were to compare myself to where I was 5 years ago, even my affective state of that feels immensely qualitatively different. So, yeah, I'm excited about that. Oh, I remembered what the word was. I called this decision, time, and translation. Now I remember. So, anyway, I'm kind of freestyling right now, so let me just wrap this thought up by saying, it was interesting talking to my best friend last weekend, since we know each other and we have known each other for such a long time, and I was saying like how much I've changed, and in the meantime she has also wildly dramatically changed, but because of different conditions. Like, she's married, so now she has like a long-term committed partnership, and they had a baby, and so now she's a parent, and she's kind of continued moving into more leadership in her job, and so she has changed wildly too, and I have changed wildly as well, but the ways that we have changed is really different. And I don't know, it's just kind of funny, because I feel like I can see how much I show up as like really feeling like a different person, and her reflection back was like, I don't know if I've done that much like self-work in the past 10 years, because there's just been so much other stuff happening. So again, I think that's why it feels so incredibly privileged to be able to have the spaciousness and the conditions to be able to do this kind of grounded work. And it also takes a lot of commitment and discipline to stay committed to the process of one's own like healing and learning and transformation too. So I'm not going to downplay the work that I have put in. It doesn't look like the work of maintaining a marriage for 10 years, but it is the work of really trying to become who I want to be over time. That means I can show up really differently. So there's been, that, I don't know, I could probably say a little bit more about that, but maybe I won't. Anyway, I'm thinking about how much I've changed, and being in the middle means that I can be in the middle differently, because I'm also realizing I'm like very much on the way. Does that make sense? If you have questions, let me know. I've often referred to this insight, when I talk about the moments that mattered with people in my life, and like the little tiny conversations or comments and things that like stick with you. I'm going to share two, because one happened yesterday and one happened 10 years ago. The one that happened 10 years ago I've referenced before. This was when I was in a new job, like a big new job, trying to do culture change on a large scale within a large organization. And after the first year, like so much had happened, but also like in the grand scheme of things, like not a lot had happened, even though there was like so much progress to mark the first year of the initiative I was leading. And my supervisor, my boss at the time, when we were kind of checking in about how progress was going, he said something that, out of all of the heartfelt, meaningful, important, insightful conversations we've had over now a decade, this was the one that stuck with me the most. He'd probably hate that, but it was when he said that time is a necessary ingredient. And so that continues to be, I guess, like the theme of what I'm sharing out today. I really didn't I don't know, maybe I was still like a little hothead back then. Um, and thinking, the elders who think that they're so smart because of their life experience. But there is something to say about experience, which comes with sometimes just living more in the time, but seeing that time is a necessary ingredient, that the phrasing of that was so succinct and so powerful that I think that's why it stayed with me. And I think back on it and I recall it so frequently because I'm always reminding myself that time is a necessary ingredient. And sometimes that's in the work that you're trying to do, but also again in like the unfolding of wanting to see the conditions around us shift too. I did want to caveat my comment on patience because when I say that I'm sitting now with a greater degree of patience, I do not want that to be conflated with like complacency, um, or like resignation. I feel like that can be a cover for a lot of people to like just be patient, as if it's like sit and wait and like you sort of release your own agency in the making of change happening or having some active participation in the process. And that's not at all how I think about patience. Instead, I'm thinking about patience as like almost like presence or mindfulness in a way, which is, if you practice any kind of mindfulness, such an active engagement that the more present you are, the more like muscle tone you have to develop over time to be able to stay that like present. Um, and it is active, it's engaged, it's attentive, it's in many ways like so present that to pay attention to what's going on, the patience is maybe like being locked in on the thing that you're, I don't want to say waiting for, not even holding out for, but like anticipating, maybe that's a good word. I don't know. But not in this way that is instead to kind of quiet or make people more, I like the idea of like docile. It's not to tamp down or quash any kind of like energy for movement. I think that you can have all of the energy and you can have a high level of commitment and a super extreme level of engagement and a impassioned, feverish kind of desire for something to happen, and still have that be coupled with this like profound patience. Changes the experience of the want and the desire and the longing, I think. I hope that's making sense. There's this, I don't know, maybe it feels like a more developed or mature or grounded kind of want that isn't so, I'm thinking like triggered by the desire for something, but it is like attuned to the longing and yet also grounded with this appreciation for the time that it will take to become. Maybe there's just like a respect built into that in a way that feels differently. Imagine if we treated each other that way, or we treated ourselves that way. And I think there's a lot more grace and compassion that comes with a sense of patience. And again, I'm not saying that this isn't to forestall or like kind of force people to wait for like social political change, but the patience involved when that's coupled with like a intensity of commitment and dedication to be present, there's really not much else that one can do other than understand that time is a necessary ingredient. Maybe I might have just said something the clearest that I've been able to get it out so far. But I know that for me, this is going to go back to the process because I've said it a little while ago, like how much I sort of rest in the knowing that as long as I'm doing as much as I can possibly do and I stay committed to doing my work every single day, which I do my absolute best at, then there's really nothing else that I can do. And so it gives me so much room to have like self-compassion and to like honor and respect and love myself in the process. Because what more could I ask for? If I'm showing up as best as I possibly can at my utmost, and then it just takes time. Like, that's just what it is. It's a waste of energy to be frustrated or impatient in the meantime. So again, imagine if we could like hold each other with that same level of patience, so long as we respect and understand that others are also showing up with that same degree of commitment. And maybe that's what we need. There might be something in there. There might be a nugget in there to like mine for a little bit more and uncover, because I think there's a slightly shifted understanding of like maybe how to navigate change within partnerships and in our intimate relationships. Where instead of it focusing on like you have to be patient, there's a slightly adjusted degree of emphasis on like, yeah, I can, as long as I know that you're showing up, and showing up in the way is also nuanced in terms of capacity. All the C words, like the capacity and the constitution that one actually has to be able to do their best, because we're always learning and growing and changing, you know? Okay, weird tangent. That was long-winded. Okay, so in this messy, sludgy middle, where I have so much patience for myself because I've learned to be able to stay grounded in that level of like compassion and grace, knowing that I'm doing as much as I possibly can, and knowing that I have a clear vision and intention of where I'm going, and it's just gonna like sort itself out in the meantime. So I just stay emergent, or like receptive to what emerges, and actively participating in the creative exploration of what could, by remaining open instead of staying like tunnel visioned or narrow minded about what that's going to look like. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Summary point. But I did also want to talk a little bit, I guess, about a thought that came up a long time ago in Liberation is Local. This was one of the pages that I shared way, way, way back when. And it's about the difference between a decision and a choice. Now, I think this is really important, because if I were to, again, look at myself with like a not very loving eye, from the outside, I could say, ugh, make up your mind, choose something, commit to it, see it through, forget your brain and how it functions, and just do a thing. Because I do know that it feels good to like do a thing and finish the like project, see it all the way through. Yeah, that's satisfying. But I can't beat myself up over it. But that, I don't want that to sound like I'm not making decisions. And here's another thought. Oh, wow, I forgot the other thing I was going to say. Should I do that now? Let me go back. The second thing that someone said, I'm just going to insert this right now. The second thing that someone said that was a moment that mattered, that happened yesterday and not 10 years ago, from my supervisor about time as a necessary ingredient. What happened yesterday is I ran into somebody in town, a friend, and she has been supportive over many years of all of my funny little experiments and spaces and like creative events and that kind of stuff. So she's seen a lot of things. And she said yesterday that her favorite thing are these live weekly updates. And that means a lot, because I like some of the spaces that I've created, like, are so fun. And I'm really, really proud of them. And then this one is always a little questionable to me. So that she said that this was her favorite because she likes to just like hear. I literally asked why. Why do you like it? But you know what? At that point, it really doesn't matter why. For me, that will become a moment that mattered, because it's nice to know that someone's paying attention. I'm not just saying there's one person. I know there are at least a handful. But I'm going to get to this, because let me write a note. The handful of people who might be following along on this journey, however and whenever they joined in, it means a lot to me that you all are here, because I understand the commitment of time and attention that it also requires to sit here with me for like an hour and 15 minutes every week, plus more if you're more engaged. So deep appreciation and gratitude for being a part of it. And I'm always curious, like, wow, what is it doing for you too? Because I'm just trying to document my process as I'm in it, knowing that something will happen. That's a thread I want to continue on with. I want to loop back to something that I said last week, directly related to this. Because last week, when I was sharing some insights on intimacy that have come up recently, one of those led me to think, like, I think this is how I said it. What if I'm putting hours and hours of content out on the internet and doing all of these things, and no one really engages with it? No one being hyperbolic, generalization. Then what is it for? And I think that what's going on there is I've been thinking a lot about reciprocity and whether intimacy requires reciprocity, whereas a meaningful connection might have varying degrees of depth or duration, and intensity, or even mutuality. So, like, for instance, the fact that that supervisor said time is a necessary ingredient became a very meaningful thing to me that shaped a lot of how I move through things ever since then. But that maybe wasn't like the most meaningful conversation he and I ever had. Maybe there was something else that has stuck with him. You know what I mean? So, like, I'm kind of sitting with this difference between intimacy and what is required for intimacy, which I'm leaning towards thinking reciprocity and a meaningful connection. But I'm not committed to that yet, because there's something about this like depth of knowing that someone can know things about a person or see a person very clearly because they've spent so much time being attentive, paying, like making connections, or seeing sort of the happening, the doing and the being unraveling in real time or retrospectively. But even in a parasocial way, for instance, like someone can have a very intimate understanding of a person, just like a anthropologist. No, I don't like that. An entomologist can have a very intimate understanding of like a specific species of butterfly because they have spent so much time observing them, like the butterfly doesn't know the researcher in the same way, but the researcher can like almost read the nonverbal body cues and nuances and subtleties because they've spent so much time with this butterfly. I'm going to leave that example there. Anyway, all that to say, last week when I was like, what if I put all this out there and no one engages with it? I didn't want that to sound like I needed people to, but I didn't finish the thought, which is really to say that I believe that there's also real value of going through a process, not just to share with the hope that other people will meet us there, but to share in terms of like the doing is itself one's own project of becoming. In that way, I would relate it much more to like a creative process, that when you're in a creative process, you just show up for it, and then you're like surprised by what happens. And whether that's doing like Julia Cameron's artist way, morning pages, or you're just trying to write and all you do is sit down so that you can write, then something happens in the meantime. But it's the creative process, I think, is one of the best examples. I mean, there are others you could probably think about, like sex and pleasure and everything, where the being in the moment and present to whatever comes through is more satisfying and revealing than trying to pursue some specific like outcome or output or finished project, to throw on some slant puns there. Anywho, even if no one were to engage, like literally, let's imagine no one were to engage and all this just now lives on the internet, I think that what I am aware of with my own process and project is that like I'm doing this mostly because it's changing me, just like living every day. If I go with the same level of intentionality of how I live, then things are going to come, and I'm curious about that for myself. So it seems kind of, you could do this, I guess, without is this a fourth wall of putting it on the internet for other people to see, whether that's in real time, hello, if you're still watching, or later on, like, because it lives on the internet, for a later date for someone to stumble upon it and then be curious enough to listen. I don't know. That connection across time and space, obviously I'm very, very curious about the nature of that, but I will still say that pursuing any kind of project with the level of commitment and passion, curiosity, just like floundering around in the abyss to be curious about what might show up there, is going to be a journey that is worthwhile even for oneself. So that's the other reason why I was like, I'm just going to keep doing this, because something's happening, even if it's just me showing up and pushing record. Okay. I promise There are connections here. I haven't lost the thread completely. I might not mention it if I forget, but I haven't lost the thread. So, decisions and choices. This is just a little like tangent to kind of give a conceptual, I don't know, resource, if you will, to be thinking about some stuff. Let me frame this up. I talk about choices so much because I am such a fanatic about freedom and the existential kind of freedom, which really ultimately boils down to notions of responsibility and choice and the projects that we choose to pursue ourselves, even in hostile or repressive conditions. I frequently refer to the bell hooks notion of oppression being experienced as an absence of choices, and then can counter that with even notions of privilege, of having access to good choices that, are to your benefit. So choice is like fundamental in sort of my worldview. The other thing that comes through when I speak about choices is my notions of power. The way that I understand power to operate is the ability to influence the conditions of our choices. So to be able to make conditions where there are more good choices available to people is something that I think is what we should be doing with our energy and our resources and our will. And our commitments, but that is mostly to affect the conditions so that people have more choices. Again, choice. So pro-choice. And when you have, let's imagine best case scenario, the freedom to choose among many available choices, all of which or many of which are like pretty solidly good choices, then it comes time to make a decision. And that's a different thing that I think a lot of people grapple with. Like, imagine if you have the privilege and the benefit of being able to be presented with many choices, which I do think a lot of people have more choices than they even realize. But that's a sort of internal conditioning thing that I'm not going to get into right now. Still, nevertheless, there is this like pivotal moment where you have to make a decision. And that is what sort of shines a light on responsibility, shines a light on accountability, it shines a light on our power and what we choose to do. Really, if we're going to use our freedom to open up more freedom for others, then the use of one's freedom ultimately comes down to making a decision based on the choices one has available to them. So this might be like really mincing words here to try to distinguish decisions and choices, but I think it's important because choices can coexist where you have many options. But when you make a decision, even you can hear sort of the root of the word decision, like incision. There's a cutting that I think that etymology of decision actually refers to like a cutting, just like incision would, or excising something, like you cut it out. So a decision is something that, just imagine a tree with all these branches. You can pick whichever way you want to go, but if you make a decision, you are cutting off some branch of possibilities and opportunities that otherwise would, continue to unfurl in some expanded way. If you make a decision and you cut off that option, now you have committed to a certain kind of path. And I think that there's something in us, I don't know what it is, but I really would be curious about how it would change our culture and our sense of reality, our sense of power, our sense of satisfaction, all sorts of things, if people got more comfortable making decisions. I didn't know I was going to say that today, but I just got struck with this thought. I also have a phrasing that I often share about like systems change or the upholding of systems. The previous phrasing would be, the original phrasing of this would be, systems are upheld by people with decision-making power who make choices. No, I don't like that, but I said this years ago. We're going to get blurry here. The way that ultimately changed for me was I was like, oh, but systems are also transformed by people with decision-making power who make choices. So maybe I'm getting a little bit loose with the language, because what I'm actually trying to say is that people with decision-making power who make decisions. among the choices available to them. So to either uphold or dismantle and transform systems requires we have choices here, and then you have to decide on one. And I think a lot of people are reluctant to make a decision because of the fact that it cuts off something like that. It's a commitment. A decision is a commitment. It doesn't mean that it's, what that actually is going to look like. Life unfolds in mysterious ways. But I don't know, I sense the kind of like angst in people. And I know myself, like even thinking of some of the decisions that I've made, when we put it as like a leap into faith, there's a clear demarcation of like the moment when you jump off of this proverbial cliff. And that is a decision. Like you make the decision to jump and you're like, no going back now. You feel that? You feel how it cut off your option to stay on steady ground the moment you decide to take the leap. Those decisions, I think some of them feel more significant. Like the gravity of the decision is palpable. But people are making decisions all the time. And I feel like there might be something important about us, like paying attention to the decisions that we do make, that we could make, or that we want to make, especially if we are deciding to move in a direction that we want to ultimately realize. I'm not going to belabor this any longer because I don't really want to be on a word semantic high horse at this moment. It's not that important to me. In this particular second of my life. But it's just I don't know. I thought about it because of the messy middle that I'm in right now, that I know that like certain decisions have to be made in order to pursue a path. And sometimes that requires cutting some things out. But like even now in this kind of transitional, pivotal space that I feel myself in, I will eventually make decisions and I have choices available to me. And like on a small scale, of course, decisions are always being made, but on a sort of medium to larger scale, I'll make a decision when I need to. I know that. So it's not like I'm avoiding a decision. Again, this is kind of like the patience of being in the process. I just know that that's on the way. And in the meantime, I'm here feeling it out. And I think that's okay. I think it's necessary. Okay, so that's decisions, I guess, time, I suppose. The last thing that I wanted to share was about translation. And this is going to feel like a very weird, wild jump, and I'm sure there's a connective thread somewhere in here. But call it one of my octopus tentacles in the brain doing its own wavy thing over here. So this tentacle is actually, I just wanted to share that like a while ago, I bought this book. I talk about it a lot. You'd think it's like my favorite book ever. It's not. But I bought the book, of course, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the reason why I bought this book is because I actually got the Walter Kaufman translation. I don't have the other one here, but the copy of Zarathustra that I have had my whole life so far is not the Walter Kaufman translation. When I know Kaufman is kind of regarded as the best Nietzsche translator into English, that there is. That was why I was curious about it, because I was like, if I'm going to read Zarathustra again, I would actually like to read a different translation, presumably a better translation. And I wonder what that would do to my understanding of the book and to my own relationship to Nietzsche. It has been a while since I've read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, just to be completely candid. And again, I'm not like a Nietzsche scholar. I haven't even really read a lot of Nietzsche since graduate school. That's partly what is so intriguing to me about this like notion of my parasocial relationship with Nietzsche and the philosophical project that sort of underpins everything. It is rooted in this idea that I had 15 years ago because of reading Nietzsche. Now, 15 years later, I'm a different person. And I'm sure my relationship to Nietzsche through the text would also change. But really important little element of that whole realm of possibility is the translation itself. I'm aware of this. I'm just going to make it extra explicit that like if we were to think about maybe my experience or your experience, this doesn't just have to be my own experience of reading somebody else's work in a language that was not what they wrote it in, that requires a translation through somebody else's interpretation, reading, and perspective, which of course is going to bring in all their own bias and bullshit of however they read it. And then we are dependent on that person's interpretation, literal translation, to then be filtered by our own constitution and bias and, desires and needs and wants, conscious or subconscious, to influence how we relate to that. So short version of that is like many layers of filtering happening here, and not just filtering, but also maybe distortions and interpretation. So there's really not a possible, like extremely not possible opportunity to have a direct connection with Nietzsche. Sorry to burst that bubble for you if you weren't aware of it. I'm very aware of that. So there are so many degrees of separation and mediation to have some relationship with Nietzsche. And like, I'm using this as an example always because it, I think, maps on to other kinds of relationships. If I'm thinking about the epistemology of intimacy, then I'm thinking about all sorts of relationships. We could say even this, like if you're listening to me, then there's going to be some mediation. That's just how we make meaning of things. We hear something and it pings a little note that, oh, that's something that someone said to me yesterday, or I've been thinking of that too. So we sort of accentuate the significance of things that are relative to us. And maybe, other things just kind of fall by the wayside until and unless something else comes around, another time, another place, new conditions, new personalities, much evolution has shifted the ways that we engage. And I think that that's likely going to be my own experience with Nietzsche. Anyway, I haven't gotten very far in reading this, and so again, I'm not turning out my KPIs here to say like, oh yeah, so now I have finally read this and here's my report back. No, I just a while ago bought this translation because I was curious about it and I knew the implications of different translations and I wanted to read the Walter Kaufmann one. And then I started it and I'm not very far. I'm 20 pages into the prologue, but I did read the translator's note, and already, like the translator's preface of this, already I was like, wow, this is interesting. That's just how I felt about it. I was like, interesting, Kaufman. There were some things that I learned about Nietzsche. I mean, if you don't know, Nietzsche was a person who is wildly misunderstood and extremely controversial, I think, because of that. And part of that is like, actually, if I could flip this camera around, I'd show you. There's a certain stereotypical notion of Nietzsche. Let me just say this little PSA. A lot of people think of Nietzsche as the philosopher with the giant mustache, and that was not who he was. Sorry. That was like pure propaganda or like weird caricature. I almost want to say like I don't know, caricaturizing, is that a word, of his sister to make him seem that way. And his sister was not like a good person, sort of like a proto-Nazi. But she propagated the images of him with that giant mustache, which a lot of people think of when they think of Nietzsche. And then he also, in his writing has such flamboyant egoism. And that can be a real turnoff to a lot of people. And he says horrible things about women too. So not particularly like holistically a lovable sort of dude. There's a lot of reason to be put off by Nietzsche. But I think it's important to recognize that, like, there's translation issues, there's language issues, there's cultural propaganda and like character defamation that he suffered from because of people like his sister, and many other people just like don't read his work. But his work is not necessarily always like the clearest. It's incredibly disruptive too. So there's a lot of complications here around Nietzsche. Maybe that's why I like him so much. Or liked him. I don't even know if I do like him anymore. But anyway, I'm curious about Nietzsche and really intrigued by his character. And one of the things that the translator preface, thanks to Kaufman, emphasized yet again for me was really that like Nietzsche was this incredibly like soft spoken, polite, and unknown character. Like he was recognized in the sense that he had jobs and he was writing and stuff, but he wasn't acclaimed. He wasn't famous. People didn't lose themselves over his work. And I think that probably frustrated him. The way that Kaufman introduces him is that like Nietzsche had this inner task. He like knew that he had this calling of something he had to do. And so he worked just incredibly hard on it. Apparently the 4 books, how did he say this? Let me see. Of Zarathustra, this is just how the translator preface starts. Zarathustra is by far Nietzsche's most popular book, but Nietzsche himself never witnessed its success. The first 3 parts, each composed in about 10 days, were at first published separately and scarcely sold at all. And then part 4, Nietzsche had only a few copies, on and on and on. In the middle of, I think, 3 and 4, he wrote The Gay Science. But to think of the first 3 parts of Zarathustra each being written in 10 days, like 30 days, just going hard, what that required was like he was for 16 hours a day hunched over in candlelight writing. But the other thing about Nietzsche, if you don't know this, he talks a lot about physiology and sickness and disease and health and vitality and all that, probably because he was such a sick dude. Like physiologically his body was up against so many problems. The way that this is described, I'm just telling you this is let's read a little bit about Nietzsche. Nietzsche basically, against all odds, worked so hard enough for hours and hours on end, hunched over, writing by hand feverishly, when his body was like betraying him in every possible way, and then he was not publicly well received. Okay, so just like think about this guy. And there's something here. There's Nietzsche's way of life. No devilish torture is lacking in this dreadful pandemonium of sickness, headaches, deafening, hammering headaches, which knock out the reeling Nietzsche for days and prostrate him on sofa and bed, stomach cramps with bloody vomiting, migraines, fever, lack of appetite, weariness, hemorrhoids, constipation, chills, night sweat, a gruesome cycle. And then his 3/4 blind eyes, which at least exertion, begin immediately to swell and fill with tears and grant the intellectual work only an hour and a half of vision of day. But Nietzsche despises this hygiene of his body and works at his desk for 10 hours, and for this excess his overheated brain takes revenge with raging headaches, nervous overcharge. At night, when the body has long become weary, it does not permit itself to be turned off suddenly, but continues to burrow in visions and ideas until it is forcibly knocked out by opiates. But even greater quantities are needed, a lot, it seems like. Then the stomach refuses to pay so high a price and rebels, and now vicious circle, spasmodic vomiting, new headaches require new medicines, and an inexorable, insatiable, passionate conflict of the infuriated organs, which throw the thorny ball of suffering to each other as in a mad game. Okay, in all of this, he didn't ever rest. So anyway, Nietzsche was a sick dude. That's why he also talks about convalescence a lot, like being able to heal from the illness. But he didn't. He did not heal. He was suffered bodily in many ways. His vision was always a big deal. But then he went mad, and apparently his body deteriorated over 11 years after his madness that kind of like took his own mind. So those are some of the gory details about Nietzsche's actual life. And on top of all of that, of course, is that he was a very lonely man. And despite his arrogance and flamboyant egoism, like I said, he comes off in letters and in like interactions as like incredibly soft-spoken, very polite, and like, unassuming, what am I trying to say? An unassuming kind of guy. So anyway, there's an interesting profile here. What I was fascinated about by this translation note by Walter Kaufmann, just kind of like reading this, was not like the gory details of Nietzsche's suffering in his own life, but how much Walter Kaufmann bashes this book as being like, if only Nietzsche would have edited it, it would have been a lot better. And there's this kind of sense of like, the writing is a little bit painful, maybe it's indulgent, it's just like, he could have made it nicer, and maybe that's because Walter Kaufmann spent so much time with it that he resents the effort of having to translate an unpolished work. But there's also this appreciation for like what is untranslatable. This is the part that catches my attention. Kaufman, being the best translator of Nietzsche, said in even the preface that there are so many pieces of Nietzsche's work that are really near impossible to translate and really convey, like, because he has so much wordplay, he makes these jokes. He would rather have a bad joke than no joke at all, apparently. And he has a lot of puns. And so there's some level of like the language and the playfulness that the meaning of even that is difficult to convey in a clear translation. So much to the point that Kaufman even said the previous translators, some of them, are like egregiously bad. But he said some of the translations like literally mean that Nietzsche hitherto could not have been understood. So he says here, one can sympathize with the translator, but one cannot understand or discuss Nietzsche on the basis of the versions hitherto available. So one can sympathize with the translator having a really hard time because it is difficult to translate so much of the nuance of Nietzsche's work. But based on that work, given that it's like kind of inherently botched, one cannot understand or discuss Nietzsche on the basis of the versions hitherto available. So Kaufman's coming in to save the day. Thank goodness. Can't wait to see how my relationship with Nietzsche changes once I get through this. But I've thought about that so much. Again, let's move away from Nietzsche and more into the personal kind of realm of intimacy and connection. I think in a situation like this of reading Nietzsche, there is an obvious overlay of the mediated degrees of separation. Hundreds of years, differences in language, difference in time and space, then the multiple layers of like interpretation and translation based on the people involved, including, like the bias or the resentments of the translators, and whatever sort of unconscious possible bias or agendas that might be latent in that. Like, I don't believe in objectivity. Nobody is purely objective. So everything is coming sort of through the eyes and mouths and ears of other people. And isn't that interesting if we think about how much the filters of meaning and translation and interpretation also exist even between us in like real time, present personal relationships. It's hard to imagine how much we could actually understand about each other, even with the clearest of language. But sometimes our experiences exceed the clearest of language. Whether that's something like it happened and you weren't there for it, so you couldn't know. But even if you were there, you would have had your own different experience. But one of my favorite things, like when I say truth is a relationship or the epistemology of intimacy, one of the things I think about is like the ways that my own understanding is influenced by relationships with other people. So I'm going to tell you a brief digression, which is that in my first semester of graduate school, I met someone who became one of my really good friends. And I love her so much, but in like 15 years since, we haven't really had a lot of contact. However, when we met, it was like fast friends for sure. And I loved her and still love her. She's one of those people where like, I know that if we were to talk to each other, it would be like easy. But one of the conversations that we had was, she was referring to this passage. I think it's Nietzsche. I feel like it's in Beyond Good and Evil. But she was like, my favorite passage of Nietzsche is this little bit where he talks about how the language, like the words that he's trying to use to describe the experience are already muted, that they could never be so brilliant and colorful and vibrant as to like do basically justice to the kind of experience that he's trying to articulate. So even the sheer act of writing is a form of mediation. We might even say mitigation that diminishes the intensity or the quality of the experience that one is trying to convey, and it just filters off. So if like the best case scenario is that you get like a hint of an idea of maybe something that this person is trying to convey, but it's so far removed from the actual thing, and there's like, I think this great sorrow in that, in the way that Nietzsche writes about it. this like recognition that like even if you are moved by these muted dull colors that are like birds dying basically instead of taking flight like I want them to, that's what moves you, will know that it's just the smallest, weakest resemblance of what I'm actually trying to convey. And that gap, I think, permeates into a kind of, maybe it's a sorrow, but I think we can push this back on Nietzsche as like character of our like focus at this point. But think about it for yourself too. I think that goes back to why he was such a lonely person. He seemed to have had an incredibly intense understanding of this inherent separation between us. And I think when you're a person with that much going on in your body, that much going on in your mind, like being able to try to push through all of that physiology and psychology to be able to connect with people is its own feat. Like an incredible, amazing feat of willpower. Then to know that even when you try to push through all of these things that are internal you to deliver something to another person that maybe they could understand, but it's going to be filtered, it's going to be translated, it's going to be distorted, and it will have now diminished and lost so much of its original inherent energy, vitality, and quality. And then what they get, if they get excited over it, you're like, if only you could have had the original source. That's the gap that I think really highlighted for Nietzsche, this like kind of pervasive loneliness in him. Anyway, just some things that I've been thinking about as I am excited to learn more and revisit my own connection to Nietzsche by reading this book again. But the real thing that I wanted to share about the translator's note that I thought was really fascinating, actually, was despite Walter Kaufmann's sort of frustrations with the translation, technically, and then also personally, because Nietzsche didn't polish it up better, there is something that he says a couple of times, and I wish I had maybe noted this a little bit more. He says something early on, which is basically that, like, if nothing else, the fact that Nietzsche wrote Zarathustra, even if it's not like the most technically clean or perfected kind of work, at the very least, he ends it with this. He says it a couple times. I'm looking for the other one. But he says this: Zarathustra is not only a mine of ideas, but also a major work of literature and a personal triumph. And that personal triumph is the piece that like kind of made my heart get a little bit warm, because I really appreciated that, at least despite Walter Kaufmann being his own person and Nietzsche being his own person, and then somehow these two are now bonded. There were 2 points in the translator's preface where Kaufmann at least acknowledged that, like, at the very least, what was going on here for Nietzsche to write this was itself like a personal achievement, because it was a record of his own account. And that is something worthwhile. I mean, yes, and Zarathustra is like a phenomenal book, and it's an incredible piece of literature, and it is such a rich, as he says, mine of ideas. So not even that, but there's this little nod to like the actual personal significance of Nietzsche doing this that I also thought was like, yeah, right? Amazing that anybody can do that. So I'm thinking about that in terms of the work that we pursue, and sort of regardless if it doesn't become a Zarathustra, if it doesn't become this pinnacle of literary achievement with historical and cultural significance for centuries, even the stuff that we try to do, if it's really coming from our own will and our own project to do what we want to do, there's so much value in that it kind of, I hope that we can value for ourselves like the personal achievement itself of just doing the thing. You see how I said there was like a long-winded, but ultimately a thread it's going to connect? I feel like that comes down to just like kind of being in the messy middle of things too. Having the patience, but even if it doesn't like turn into anything, just the sheer act of doing our projects is going to be worthwhile if they're really the projects we want to pursue. And somewhere in there, I'm sure there's a connection to being like making a decision to choose the life path that we want and becoming the people we want to be and orienting ourselves on a certain path moving forward. But even if you're clear on that, it's still going to take time. Still going to be a journey. There's still going to be this middle space where something's happening and it's not all just popping off in conclusions and outcomes. So, okay, that was really what I had. I know this was kind of like wandery, but that's typical and I'm okay with it now. So, what else is going on? Let me be really candid. The middle space that I'm in is like, honestly, I'm trying to figure out how to fit into this umbrella of an epistemology of intimacy with the gadfly. What does that look like? And my new realized energy that is sort of quickly manifesting towards DJ-isms. Where does that fit in? And Romance and Revolution, I knew this. Like, there's this other phrase that I often share that someone said about me in 2008 about wherever Cori's going, she's already there. And that was confusing to me. But I trust that so much now, too, that like wherever I'm going, I'm already there. I believe that. So I did name weeks and weeks ago that like Romance and the Revolution is also going to shift. And I'm excited for that. It's just going to take time to get there. I know that. So I'm in the middle of it. I'm not rushing that. It will happen. But I'm excited for what Romance and the Revolution is going to become as a different kind of space. That I think, you know, just true to form, case in point, by doing it, by being in it, things get clearer or edges get a little bit more defined. And then something takes shape and now we can see what it is. So that's how the process of Romance and the Revolution for me has gone in the past 3 months. And it wouldn't happen. It would not have happened to get clearer or more defined if it didn't just be first, whatever it is, and then evolve in the meantime. So that's, I guess, the high level punchline for all of this is just like, this is what it looks like to be in the process. And it's not just okay to be in the process. It's actually like necessary. There's no way around it. It's inevitable. Okay. That's what I've got. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening and watching if you are. Yeah, I'll be back, I guess, next week. We'll see how things go this weekend with the gadfly. And quickly moving into June, which will be so much fun. My birthday month. Okay, be well. Talk to you soon. Bye.